Talking Heads, brought to you by Magic Carpets, with the only Carndine design showroom on the island.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Hello and welcome to the latest look back over some of the items up for discussion on Talking Heads. Pensions, and more pensions on the programme during the past week. We'll hear more about that shortly. But we started the week with talk of a living wage. Here's Stu Peters with more.
Does the Isle of Man need a living wage? We touched on this on the programme last week when plans were announced by the UK government to introduce the increased wage over there. It'll mean that anyone across the water over 25 living outside London will get £7.20 an hour. That's 70 pence an hour more than the UK's minimum wage. That figure will rise to £9 an hour by 2020. The island's minimum wage stands at £6.65 for workers over the age of 21. And the idea of a living wage is an issue that's raised its head in both Tynwald and the House of Keys before. One of its supporters is Douglas West MHK Chris Thomas.
KPMG, who are an important advisor in our island to our government, have actually been quite instrumental in the campaign inside the UK, which eventually persuaded the UK Chancellor to come up with the budget proposal yesterday. And one of the arguments they've always used is it's very good for growth, having people earning enough to pay properly for the proper lives, and that in itself is something that we've got to think about, because the value of a pound in terms of the multiplier, if it's going to be more valuable by paying it to somebody who's poorer, that's a second reason other than just the intrinsic one, as it's not right that people don't have enough to live on.
Is the idea plausible, do you think? Could it lead to a boost in the economy as lower paid workers' earnings rise? Or would it be simply unaffordable for many businesses and lead to an actual reduction in jobs? Cliffy, not particularly helpful today. Only management are allowed pay rises. How dare the workers ask for more? They should be glad for what they get. Tommy Cole, we don't need pay rises. What we need is more stability. It's a vicious circle. If pay goes up, then so does the cost of everything else. We need stability to keep everything low. But with rents and things going up by 10%, then another 10%, we don't have stability. That's a good thought as well. And I think Chris Thomas said that, the idea behind this is that if people are paid more, then they're going to be able to spend more. And it's going to sort of go around, one hand sort of shakes another kind of thing as it goes through the system, and everybody ends up better off. I'm not convinced about that. Let's go to the lines. We've got Dreda on for a chat about this. Hello, Dreda.
Well, to be honest with you, I'm a Manx girl. I'm 77 now.
Yeah.
And I married an RAF guy.
Yes.
And we had to get off the island. He wasn't allowed to work.
All right.
I did eventually get back home to the Isle of Man.
Yes.
So, in the end, I was running this sheltered accommodation. I enjoyed it. £10 a week. Now, I was quite happy with that because, as far as I'm concerned, Stu, the Isle of Man people have never had much in the way of a lot of money.
So you think the Isle of Man wages have historically been quite low? I suppose it depends on what sort of business you're in. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, lovely to talk to you, Dreda. Thank you very much for calling today. And let's speak to Oz. Hello, Oz.
Well, I just found it quite interesting. I was listening to something on Radio 4 about an economist speaking about the Greek crisis at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
And he said it's like the baker and the barber syndrome. No one's buying the baker's bread.
Yeah.
The baker can't afford to go and get his hair cut. And if he doesn't get his hair cut, the barber can't afford to buy his bread.
Yeah, sure.
If you get what I mean.
I do, absolutely.
Where's he suddenly found this money? Has he been rooting around down the back of the sofa in the House of Commons?
No, my impression is that George Osborne, it's not going to cost him a penny. If anything, he's going to make more money because this is going to fall on employers.
Where does this fund come from?
This from Michelle. As far as I can make out, all this living wage is going to do is to put prices up to pay for it. Everybody will lose out, but government will gain. Lose for us and win-win for them, as usual, says Michelle. Let's go to the lines and see what Norman thinks. Hello, Norman.
I think the so-called living wage is a farce. At £7.20 an hour, you're not going to get much for a 40-hour week. And by the time you pay your national insurance contribution, a little bit of tax, because you'll still have to pay tax, then you pay your rent, your heating and your electricity, your food, there's very little left. It's purely an existence to live on. I think £7.30 an hour, it really is very, very poor.
But who's going to pay for it, Norman? That's the question, isn't it? Who's going to pay for it?
The consumer is going to pay for all this because the wage earner is going to get it from his boss. His boss is going to get the money from the people who he supplies.
Yes.
And in the end, the consumer will pay.
So it's putting up the price for all of us, effectively.
Unfortunately, yes.
All right. Thank you very much for your call, Norman. Some important points there. It appears to me that those against the living wage are quite happy for the poorest in society to be exploited. We all surely should expect to be able to live off the money we earn and not be taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers. Those who moan about this because it would make the purchases more expensive are part of this cycle of exploitation. They're insisting that there should be an exploited underclass in society for the benefit of those who can afford the price rises that would come from the pay increases. Mr Osborne is making a great effort in order to redress this imbalance in UK society, which unfortunately is not being taken up by our government. Mr Tear seems happy with the exploitative status quo and the retention of the tax cap at the other end of the pay spectrum. That from Mark. Thank you.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Public sector pensions were in the headlines again this week, ahead of this month's Tynwald sitting.
Should action be taken quicker to address the shortfall in public sector pension funding? Tynwald members will be asked to approve the transfer of £5.2 million out of the Public Service Employees Pension Reserve Fund next week. Treasury says the additional money is needed because of an increase in the number of government staff taking early retirement or deciding to transfer their pension entitlements from the public sector. Net expenditure on pensions in 2014-15 was £58.4 million against a budget of just £26 million. In the 2015-16 budget, Tynwald members approved the transfer of £27 million from the fund to make up the shortfall. But now approval will be sought for extra money to address what the Treasury Minister says is a short-term cash flow issue. Concerns over the matter have been raised in the recent past by Michael MHK Alfred Cannon, who's accused the government of failing to get the situation under control. Should decisive action be taken swiftly to address the shortfall between payment and payouts, or could that end up exacerbating the problem in the long term? Let's go to the lines and see what Jonty makes of this. Hello, Jonty.
We do need more people paying into the scheme to sustain it. Now, of course, government has lost a lot of its workers through resignation schemes, and now it is re-employing people on zero-hour contracts and short-term contracts who aren't paying into the pension scheme.
Yeah.
So they've actually floored themselves on that one.
Well, it was a problem that they could never solve, that, isn't it? Because, you know, they're talking about that they need to reduce the size of government because they've got a third less income than they used to have. And so everybody kind of understands that. But if they do that, it means that the pensions just become unsustainable completely.
Oh, well, we just let the wrong people go, effectively. Although a lot of the people on the bottom, on the front line, have gone. I mean, here's your predicament right now. The hospital is one case, an example. This idea that we would raise the minimum retirement age from 55 to 58 actually actuarially wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't delay any sort of shortfall.
Right.
But what it does do is put the fear of God at the workforce, who are, when they get or at that age, as we're an ageing workforce, just clear off.
Right.
And that, of course, depletes the funds. So.
Yeah.
That's why that's been shelved, because it simply doesn't make any difference.
So what's the answer? I mean, you obviously understand this better than I do, but didn't Eddie Tear say something about the fact that the current pension entitlements that people have got are worth something like 30% of salary, but people's contributions are only something like 5%? I mean, that, again, if that's true, is completely unsustainable, isn't it?
Partly true. Since 2012 and the inception of the government unified scheme, prior to that, civil servants didn't pay anything to their pension scheme, to their classic scheme. We did on the manual side, so did the NHS people, so did the electricity board, police, all these people that we've been paying in for years.
Yes.
But since about 1973, actually, to go back to the Scheme 1.
Thank you very much, John T. I need to move on. Stu, public sector pensions, you mentioned that this subject comes up a lot. Well, it does, doesn't it? I think it's one of the biggest issues that people are quite happy to talk about at the moment, that a lot of people feel aggrieved about it. Well, until it's properly addressed, the subject needs to continue to crop up and indeed become a chief election issue. This is the biggest of all the elephants in the room, the elephants trumping and parping and doing all manner of boisterous elephant-type things. But, of course, our government are an integral controlling part of that very beast. Long live the beast, says Chris. Good afternoon, Stu. Well, here's another fine mess they've got us into. Despite his book passing, Alan Bell is number one suspect in this. As Treasury Minister, he oversaw this gravy train on its irresponsible way, happy to wave it off and capitulate to every demand from the public sector unions. Years ago, a job in the public sector meant a job for life, fine, but in return it was accepted that paying conditions would be less than those available in the private sector. That's my understanding of this, yeah. Stu, Eddie Tear is asking for more money to top up government staff pensions, reason being people taking lump sums. Why are government employees' lump sum pension payments not taxed, while those in private pensions have theirs taxed? Very good question. We'll never get anywhere with public sector pension reforms when it's effectively public sector pension recipients making the decisions. It's like turkeys voting for Christmas, says Paul. Yep. Stu, they blame all this on the workforce, but where does the money for the previous MHK's free pension schemes come from? Is this the same fund? The government has reduced the workforce, so there's less going into the pot. Well, that's the trouble with this. Ordinary civil servants can't do right for doing wrong. There was massive encouragement for staff to use the Mars scheme to leave after the cry to cut staff numbers. Obviously, they had to be given an inducement as it was voluntary. It was a scheme devised and encouraged by those in power, and now Eddie is complaining that staff who took it have drained resources. Wish he would stop blaming others for government gaffes. I work for government and pay into my pension. Does Cannon pay into his? I also think that what we pay in has to go up as long as it goes up for MHKs, says Derek. Well said, Jonty, says Liz. Jonty called earlier. Scrap the scheme and get a private scheme. We can all calculate how underfunded this scheme is, says somebody. Stu, the answer to all this is a Tynwald Committee on Equitable Pensions for All. Comyn can't be trusted to deliver this, says William. If you challenge Tyr about this, he always turns it to competition to retain doctors, etc. Nothing to do with them. It's the top earners in the civil service who are milking it and taking the mickey, and it's got to stop, says John.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
And we stayed with the theme of pensions on Wednesday, but moved out of the public sector.
Should people in the island be afforded more freedom when it comes to private pensions? New rules shaking up the UK pensions market came into effect back in April. Figures show that £1.8 billion has been withdrawn from defined contribution schemes by the over-55s since the new rules were implemented in the UK just over 3 months ago. There are concerns that the money withdrawn will be wasted, leaving taxpayers to cover the bill of supporting people in their older age. But next week, Michael MHK will ask Tynwald to support new measures allowing Island savers to withdraw their pension funds rather than have to buy a retirement annuity. To tell us why, we're joined in the studio now by Alfred Cannon. Good afternoon, Mr. Cannon. Thanks for joining us on the programme today.
Good afternoon, Stu.
This is something that surprises me in that the Isle of Man government usually just mirrors whatever happens in the UK. It was quite a sort of a bold step, I think, by the Chancellor in the UK to relax the rules as far as private or company pensions were concerned. And I'm quite surprised that we've not mirrored it here. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I was. I mean, the UK is bringing in significant reforms to pensions, full stop, both state and private, and I think the overall package is designed as one. So really there has been a big shake-up, but I was surprised because I've asked the Treasury Minister a couple of times in the last few months as to whether we are going to have the same reforms here, and the answer has been quite categorically no. That's why I've brought the motion forward, and I think that, you know, given the fact that this shake-up is taking place across the pensions industry, it's not right that we should have potential unfairness on the island between people who may have an Isle of Man pension and people who may have a UK pension, and there's quite a lot of people in that situation. But also from a business perspective, the fact is the industry is changing now, and we have got to really get to grips with that from that side of things. I've spoken to a number of people in the financial services industry. I spoke to a leading IFA yesterday, and the feedback that I'm getting is actually money that was coming to be invested in the island in pension funds is now not coming because the freedoms are not here. And also, I think that aside from dealing with the issue of fairness, I think fundamentally the Chancellor of the Exchequer is right. You know, people should be trusted with their retirement savings. This is not sort of government money. We've got to move away from the sort of nanny state and actually empower people to have more control. And I think that when people get to 55, if they've had the responsible attitude to put their savings to one side and plan for their retirement, they should have a much greater say as to how those savings are being used. I mean, well, the argument's been put to me that people are going to fall back and the state's going to have to somehow supplement people's retirement. Well, in actual fact, we've got a state pension now, so I just don't understand. That's applicable to everybody. It's not means tested. It's a state pension. Everybody can get it. If somebody does choose to go and blow their retirement savings on, you know, fast cars and glamorous holidays, well, my view is at age 55 plus, they know the consequences and they will have to work and live off the state pension. But I just don't buy that argument.
Let's go to the lines. We've got Pat waiting to speak to us about it. Hello, Pat.
I'm very annoyed at what Mr. Tyr said. For him to turn around and say that would be irresponsible with our money money that we have been responsible enough to build up to make a pension for us, to give us a better quality of life in our older age, I think he has a damn cheek. Apart from that, I have a brother. He's been divorced. He's now 60-odd. He has sold his house, which was separated between him and his wife. He hasn't enough money to buy another house at the moment. He has a pension due out next year that the government, well, Mr. Tier is trying to stop him getting his amount of money that he needs to actually buy another house for himself to live in. Now then, do they want him at his age to try and get a mortgage because they are stopping him or trying to stop him getting his own money that he has paid into?
I know, it's crazy.
I think this is downright ridiculous. It is our money. We've paid into these schemes. We've been responsible enough to do this. And Mr. Tier has no rights to turn around and say that we will be irresponsible with our own money that we have saved for our old age.
All right, fair dues. That's Pat's view on it. I mean, I think it's important to say that this isn't something that Eddie Tier has stopped. This is something that's changed in the UK. Up until April, it was the case that in the UK, people weren't considered responsible enough to cash out the pensions in full. It's just that we're not, as usual, following the UK. Let's have a look at some more texts. We've got quite a few. I'd like to ask all the public who have a private pension to lobby their MHKs to back Mr. Cannon with this. After all, this is our money, says Al. Treasury Minister says he doesn't trust us. I have a private pension. It's a small one, about 55 grand, but I can't get my hands on it. What really gripes me is that there are 3 companies who take fees off me to manage it each year. This is a very good point. And I've already paid tax on that money. The reason Mr. Tier doesn't want us to be able to withdraw the cash is because the sector would go out of business because they'd have no customers. Of course, the pensions industry is against pensions freedom. They would rather that they bought the proverbial Lamborghini than the people whose money it actually is. This is from Chris. As reported on Manx Radio, chief exec of one of these companies said income tax paid on cash drawn from pensions is vital revenue for Treasury and it wants a steady stream. Well, I feel that's a ridiculous and desperate argument and tentative at best. The government's going to get the tax anyway. It's the pension holders who matter here, not the government. Well, and to say, we don't want to have a big influx of cash all of a sudden, we'd rather have a steady stream. That's like the Treasury Minister saying that, he can't trust his officers not to spend it all at once. I mean, it's just the reverse argument, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other interesting thing is that one resident wrote to me. I've had a number of letters on this issue, but one resident wrote to me to inform me that the IPA on the Isle of Man had told her that she could actually transfer her pension back to the UK, having previously brought it here. She could transfer it back and thus have access to the pension freedom. So that to me just doesn't make any sense. We're so inextricably linked here in so many ways, Stu, that in many ways some of these arguments are almost irrelevant. We have to do it because we have to move, we have to go with the flow, because the unfairness that's being created anyway amongst some people who have UK pensions, those who don't, just make it inoperable, really.
All right.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
We'll go back to the issue of pensions shortly, but first, concerns over the state of some of the pavements and footpaths in the island.
The island's roads and pavements need more attention. Problems with weeds growing on pavements and in road gutters around the island have been raised with the Infrastructure Minister. Tim Glover spoke to DOI Minister Phil Gorn and began by suggesting the island looks really scruffy at the moment.
I don't wholly agree, but I do know what you're saying. I mean, there are areas around the island, particularly I think the issue that you're most concerned about, and I would agree, is weeds growing at the side of pavements and maybe in gullies at the sides of roads. That is a concern, and it's an issue that clearly we need to get sorted. That said, to give a kind of a bit of background to this, recently we've been having a major exercise working with local authorities in terms of transferring over some highways maintenance functions. We were hoping to conclude by the 1st of April, but in many cases it was well into May and some into June before we actually completed all the transfers. Now, as a result of that, I think there have been some delays perhaps in getting everything sorted this year that may have been happening maybe 2 or 3 weeks earlier than it is. So we're noticing to a far greater extent the problem, I think.
Should more be done to tidy up the island's pavements and roads, or is there little difference to the state of the highways this year than there has been in previous years? I'm not going to go too far into the standard of the island road, says Gary. Safe to say that they're more or less a disgrace. What does bother me is that around Douglas there are many, many instances of overgrown hedges jutting out onto the pathway, causing people to almost walk in the road. This has the potential to cause injury or worse to anyone, but particularly the elderly or people of restricted sight. Douglas Corporation need to get a grip on this and either fine people or send council workers to cut the hedges and bill the people accordingly. If the house happens to be a council house, then the cost for the work should be added to the occupant's rent, says Gary. That seems fair, yeah. Here we go again. We'll be paying the same in tax, so where will the local authorities get the wherewithal to pay for these transferred services? Obviously expect a hike in your annual rate demand. In the future, I'd be at all surprised to find that the government want the local authorities to pay for the salary of their MHKs representing the respective areas, says Chris. Yeah, shh. I've recently bought a property in Saddlestone. The pavements are awash with weeds and the odd hogweed. There's also glass all over the pavement on Horseshoe Avenue. Such a beautiful area. It's a shame this work, which needs to be carried out, should be included in the rates. Well, it kind of is, isn't it? Let's go to the lines. We've got Jill on. Hello, Jill.
Well, I'd just like to inform one of your previous texters that people do still walk. The road that Minister Gorn mentioned by the airport is very popular with walkers.
Right.
I complained last year about the state of it because you were gradually getting pushed nearer and nearer to the curb.
Yes.
And I was going to complain again this year, but it's been done, I'm pleased to say.
Happy days.
Yeah, but I just wonder, now in Canada, people are responsible for clearing the snow in front of their own houses. So how about if everybody got the community spirit and cleared the weeds in front of their houses?
Not a bad idea, yeah.
I mean, all right, I know there are some people who can't, and the DOI would have to be responsible for that, but they know who those people are.
On the face of it, it's a good idea. I mean, people are certainly responsible for hedges and things on their property, so
yes.
To take that out to the full extent of the plot, yeah, it makes good sense. We've just had family over who commented on the unsightly condition of the island due to the unchecked and uncut hedges and verges. Also commented on dangers of road signs obscured and lack of vision at some roads when needing to exit a junction. It's not safe, says Susan. I understand about budget cuts and that the pot is finite, but if we hope to continue to encourage walkers to visit the public footpaths, especially the coastal way, need care and attention. Tried walking part of the old railway route out of Kirkmichael towards Peel and had to give it up. It was all but overgrown. I know things have had a growth spurt recently, but this is to be expected and should be planned for. That from Paula. Weeds can look quite colourful, says Irene. Now, I like this, Irene. Your pot's half full, isn't it? But the cans, bottles and other rubbish on the Castletown Road do not. Why do people do that? Well, because they're idiots, frankly.
Talking Heads, brought to you by Magic Carpets, with the only Carndine design showroom on the island.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
You're listening to the latest Talking Heads podcast, featuring highlights from the programme over the past week. And it was back to pensions on Thursday, more specifically, the early retirement age for those in the public sector.
Should the early retirement age for public sector workers be raised? Douglas East MHK will attempt to have public sector pensions discussed at next week's sitting of Tynwald. Chris Robertshaw will ask for support for an emergency debate on the issue. The motion reads that Tynwald calls upon the Public Sector Pensions Authority Joint Working Party to review and reconsider its position regarding the early retirement age and to report back to the October 2015 Tynwald. For this morning's mandate, Mr. Robertshaw told Tim Glover more.
I was absolutely astonished to find a circular coming from the PSPA Working Party saying effectively, well, you know, we were going to extend the age at which you could get early retirement. Well, that's now been removed. So the same afternoon that Treasury said we're going to have to extend the age at which you can get your state pension, the PSPA Working Party said, well, actually, the government staff are okay. Now, that is utterly unacceptable and is beginning to create sort of a festering resentment.
Should the age at which public sector workers retire be increased, or could that dissuade workers from joining the government workforce in the first place in future? And let's go to the lines. We've got Neil on. Hello, Neil.
It'll be interesting to see how much support Mr. Robertshaw gets. If my memory serves me correct, 4 years ago, this was one of the main areas of contention and debate in the electorate on the island, the fact that we are subsidising this pension fund to a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
In fact, it was 5 years before that, which was 9 years ago now, and absolutely nothing has altered during that course of time.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at the information on this from the Pensions Committee, the PSPA Pensions Committee, the joint notice sent out to members, and it says both the working group and the Council of Ministers don't think it's acceptable that 60% of the last financial year's pension expenditure of £89 million had to be met by the Pensions Reserve and consequently by the Manx taxpayer from funds that could be used directly for public services. I mean, that's the top and bottom of this, surely, isn't it?
What it effectively boils down to is that anyone in the private sector is underwriting this scheme for millions and millions of pounds per year.
Yeah.
Most people in the private sector had their final salary pension funds closed a number of years ago because they were deemed unsustainable.
Yep, absolutely.
We're all in the same boat, and yet here we are, nothing has altered. The status quo has not altered for civil servants and, of course, our MHKs who are affiliated within the scheme. I mean, it's just disgraceful that the next generation of people coming up are being asked to work until they're 70.
Yeah.
Mr Tear has just said he is not willing to accept the affiliation with the UK government in regard to the working wage. The cost of living on the Isle of Man is substantially higher. The tax differential now is not that great. In fact, the personal tax liability within the UK is greater than it is now for those living up on the Isle of Man. It seems to me that everything is stacked against the person within the private sector. Just absolutely immoral. I mean, we have people working in the service industry on very, very low levels of pay, a high cost of living, and we have senior civil servants and others who are jumping ship and getting out with as much as they possibly can in case this scheme is closed. I mean, the whole thing is absolutely appalling.
All right. Good to talk to you, Neil. Thank you very much for your call today. Let's go to line 4. We've got Jonty on. Hello, Jonty.
I think we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this subject. As Mr. Cannon today on our show, he felt that people with private pensions shouldn't be penalised, and he mentioned them being able to cash their pensions in at 55. Well, if it's raised for public sector workers, then there's clearly a prejudice against public sector workers. Secondly, the public sector pension scheme is not subsidised by the private sector. I disagree with that. I mean, say I've been paying into this for 21 years. If I went early at 55, my pension would be actuarially reduced roughly by 5% per year.
Yeah.
So if my retirement age is 65 and I went at 55, I'd lose 50% of it. Many of us on the front line, on the basic salaries, we don't go early because we can't afford to. What this scheme needs to be done is just managed with more money going into it, which it will be. I think we don't need to be upsetting people and telling them that it's all going to fail and there's massive deficits and let's panic and do this and that.
Well, yeah, but I'm listening to what you're saying, Jonty, and it's always good to get the other side of an argument on things like this, so I appreciate you calling in. But it's not like a private pension scheme that is funded. This is not funded, and that's the big difference. So surely members have got to realise that they can only get out what they put into it, which is a fraction of what they're getting out at the moment because the taxpayer is paying the rest.
Well, this is what you pay in, you do get out from people on my sort of wages, and this was the whole inception of the Government Unified Scheme 3 years ago, was to make it work financially, and that's what we're in the process of doing. This is what the negotiations are about, and that is why everybody that's in it now pays into it.
All right, well, I hope you're right, and I hope that the negotiations are about what is the best for the Isle of Man as well as for the members. Don't blame the all the government employees for the problem about public sector pensions. It's weak leadership and weak government that's to blame. I expect you're probably right, yeah. Good to hear Mr. Robert Shaw talking sense on the pensions issue. Let's have a Tynwald inquiry on pension equality, says William. Allowing government workers to retire at 55 on a full pension plus a state pension is discrimination. Well, they'll not get a state pension until 65 or whatever. They should raise the government retirement age to 65 like the rest of us. Why should the majority subsidise the few on golden pensions? Well, as Jonty said, you know, if you're working in the private sector and you've got a private sector pension, there is an early retirement clause in that says that, for most people anyway, that you can retire early at 55 if you want to do, and you lose part of the benefit, but you can retire early. So if that's good enough for the private sector, then it should be good enough for the public sector as well. Your programme is becoming obsessed with public sector pensions. Well, we have been doing a lot on it this week, but it is the burning issue. I mean, it's the front page story on the newspapers as well. In fact, it's creating the impression that government is using your programme to get the views aired. Actually, just the opposite. I think that everything that we've said this week has been fairly sort of anti-government, if anything, allowing people to have their say about it. And that's the important reason for this programme. I'm not bothered about my pension. If you manage to reach pension age, then you haven't lived your life to the max. That's from David of Andreas. How about reducing the number of MHKs? We've got far too many. Well, that's something that we hear a lot. Hi, Stu. Why can't we scrap the pension scheme and all just pay into our own private scheme? Seems the only fair way to do it. That way people at work get pensions. People who don't won't get pensions. Yeah, that's a way of looking at it. Pension reserve is not taxpayer money. It's the money that contributors have paid in. The equivalent of a savings account. The money is running down because, one, it paid for the hospital, two, a lot are higher paid and therefore higher savers are withdrawing their funds because of uncertainty, and three, some people were non-contributory, well, politician, judiciary. There's been a lot of redundancy or non-replacement of government staff. That, according to Jan.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
On Friday, Stu explored some of the items which will be debated in Tynwald next week, with the help of a studio guest.
Next week's sitting of Tynwald Court looks set to be one of the busiest for some time, as well as items being moved by members of the Council of Ministers, which includes reforms to the state pension and an updated Agenda for Change document. There are 7 motions being brought forward by members from the backbenches. 3 of those are being championed by Douglas South MHK Kate Beecroft. They cover staff performance in the public service, providing an independent regulator for the health service, and a call for politicians to start paying for the reserved parking. To tell us about those items and the reasons for bringing them forward, we're joined in the studio now by Douglas South MHK and Lib Van Party leader Kate Beecroft. Good afternoon, Mrs. B, and thanks for joining us on the programme.
Hi, Stu, you're welcome. Good, nice to be here.
Is it an ombudsman for the health service?
No, it's an independent regulator. We need an ombudsman in general anyway. But it's like the Care Quality Commission is the regulator in the UK. They have the power to go in and check whatever they want to. They set their own timetable, they go in whenever they want, and they can make sure that if they're important recommendations, if they're recommendations regarding patient safety or best practice, they can make sure that those recommendations are carried out. We don't have that luxury here. I've compared it to an auditor.
Right.
And a company.
I see.
A company has a statutory requirement, if it's large enough, to have an auditor. The auditor has to report on certain things, both to the directors and to the shareholders. The auditor reports on whether things in the last year have been done correctly, but he also points out areas of significant weakness where you could come unstuck.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is the true value of an auditor, regulator, whatever, is that they can say, if you don't do something about this, this could happen.
Okay.
So you're stopping something happening before the event, if you like.
Prevention better than cure.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. And why do you think that we need that? Do you think that the health service isn't doing a good enough job? Do you think that there are cracks?
Listen, this is nothing to do with any criticism of the health service. It's not a criticism of the minister or his team. This is just the next step along the road of what I honestly think should happen, and what I think the people of the Isle of Man are entitled to. Because if you look at anywhere else in the UK, and in fact most of the civilised world, they have a regulator.
Yeah.
Why would we be different? Why would we not need the same comfort and assurance that the regulator brings to other jurisdictions? Why would we be different here?
The other one, which is bound to be popular, is that you think that all Tynwald members should pay for their parking, their reserved parking places. Now, this came up a while ago, and I thought this was a done deal, that everybody was going to have to pay for their own parking places, and senior civil servants as well.
Well, I think that certainly was the intention, but it seems to have been derailed, and for whatever reason. But regardless of whatever reason,
there can only be one reason, and that is that the senior civil servants and the politicians don't want to pay for the car parking. That's
probably,
the only reason
yes. Let's cut to the chase.
Well,
yeah, there isn't really much else in the way of choices, is there? So if that's their opinion and it's been derailed, it doesn't mean that Tynwald members cannot go ahead on their own and say, well, we're going to pay for ours.
Yeah.
And I think in the time, you hear them saying so many times, we're all in this together, we've all got to pull together. Well, I think it's about time Tynwald members actually did do something to pull together, to show that they're prepared to lead by example.
I'm amazed that politicians just don't seem to care anymore about how things look. Whatever the reality of a situation, and whether or not Tynwald members paying for the car parking is going to make a jot of difference to the balance sheet is immaterial.
It's a principle. You don't ask other people to do things that you're not prepared to do yourself.
And the third thing that you're looking at is some sort of performance thing for public sector workers. I mean, surely everybody in every job, whether it's public or private sector, they have to perform the task that they're employed to do, don't they? Otherwise the bosses will get rid of them.
They do, but I'm sure that virtually every Tynwald member and anybody who's had anything to do with government can name people who certainly don't seem to be capable or choose not to do their job as they should be doing it.
Okay.
And they don't seem to get penalised in any way for this. In fact, if anything, you see them sometimes getting promotion,
right? Okay.
etc. And it feels wrong. It obviously is something to do with the model or the system of performance management that they're actually using at the moment. But interestingly enough, I'm not actually sure if I'll be taking this motion forward next week or not, because I have been approached to say that if I will consider deferring it until the October sitting, it's possible that the Council of Ministers will be more supportive of the motion.
Okay.
And to me, it's a question of getting the performance management right rather than scoring points.
Yes.
So I'm still considering that one, but there is a possibility it'll be waiting till October.
Well, that's interesting actually, because some of your critics say that you make an awful lot of noise and you're just there to stand against everything that the Council of Ministers wants to do. But what you're saying is that actually you do work with them on certain occasions and come up with something that's best for everybody.
Well, I'm not unreasonable. I think people who think that I am actually are just listening to the propaganda that some Council of Minister members care to put out against me.
Is it fair to say that the Lib Van Party is the de facto opposition to government in the Isle of Man, small and humbly sized though it might be? Are you effectively a rallying point for the few backbenchers? Because there aren't many of you, are there?
There aren't a lot of us. I suppose we could be classed as the opposition, but when you look at our voting record, I would say probably 95% of the time we actually vote with government. So if you're classing us as an opposition, maybe we're not a very good opposition. But at those times, you don't see a headline that says Lib Van supported 28 out of 30 things on the agenda paper, do you?
No.
They make a big hoo-ha about the two things that we didn't agree with government on.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
That's it for the latest look back at Talking Heads. Thanks to everybody who took part. A reminder that you can listen live to the programme each day between midday and 2 p.m, when you can get involved by calling, texting or emailing, or you can catch up on each day's programme in full by using the on-demand feature on manxradio.com. You can keep up to date with the topics up for discussion each day by visiting the website, by liking the Facebook page, Talking Heads with Stu Peters, or by following Stu Manx on Twitter. And if you want to continue the debate after the programme each day, the Facebook page is the best place to do it. But there is the usual reminder that you need to keep what you post within reason. If you'd like to suggest a topic for discussion on the programme, email talk@manxradio.com, and you can do that anytime. But that's it for now, so until next time, goodbye.
Talking Heads, brought to you by Magic Carpets, with the only Carndine design showroom on the island.